It began on a train, a whistle in the distance, the rhythmic grind of steel wheels on iron tracks. 9 boys, young and restless, boarded that southern train with little more than the ragged clothes on their backs and a pocket full of dreams. They had no idea that this single ride would decide the course of their entire lives, that they would step off this train not as hopeful job seekers but as prisoners, accused of a heinous crime they did not commit. They didn't know that their names would echo for decades, long after their childhoods were stolen from them. This is the story of the Scottsboro Boys, a story of lies, hatred, survival, and the endless, haunting question, what is justice worth when the truth is silenced? It was March 25, 1931. The world was in the iron grip of the Great Depression. In the American South, poverty was a constant shadow, racism was the law of the land, and justice was anything but equal. That morning, a freight train rumbled through Paint Rock, Alabama. On board were 9 young African-American boys: Haywood Patterson, Clarence Norris, Ozzie Powell, Willie Robertson, Eugene Williams, Olin Montgomery, Charlie Weems, and the brothers Andy and Roy Wright. Most were teenagers. The youngest, Roy, was only 12 years old. Like so many others, they had hopped the train looking for work, chasing the faint promise of jobs in distant cotton fields or factories. But they weren't alone. Also on that train were a group of young white men and 2 white women named Victoria Price and Ruby Bates. Tensions were high, and a fight broke out between the black and white riders. Rocks were thrown. Fists flew. Eventually, the white men were forced off the train. Humiliated and furious, they went to the nearest station master and spun a tale that would ignite a firestorm. The black boys had attacked the white women. By the time the train reached Paint Rock, an angry mob was already waiting. Sheriffs stormed the cars, guns drawn. The 9 boys were pulled out one by one, beaten, handcuffed, and dragged to the local jail. That very night, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates accused them of rape. There was no investigation. There was no physical evidence, just their words. And in 1931, Alabama, for a black boy, words like that were a death sentence. In the Deep South, accusations weren't questions. They were verdicts. The boys were charged with rape, a capital offense. Within hours, the world had branded them criminals. Just 2 weeks later, the boys were in court. There was no time to prepare, no time to even process what was happening. The courthouse in Scottsboro overflowed with white townsfolk, their faces pressed against the doors, hungry for a verdict. The boys sat in their tattered clothes, faces bruised, their eyes wide with a fear no child should ever know. Their lawyers? Court-appointed men who barely spoke to them. One was a local drunk who admitted he hadn't even read the charges. The other was so old and frail he could hardly stand. The trial wasn't a defense. It was a performance. Victoria Price took the stand and spun her fabricated tale, painting the boys as monsters and herself as a helpless victim. Ruby Bates sat beside her, quiet, letting the lies grow heavier with each passing moment. The doctors who had examined the women testified that there was no evidence of rape, but their expert opinions were drowned out by the roar of prejudice. The jury, all white, all male, deliberated for less than a day. 8 of the 9 boys were sentenced to death by electric chair. The youngest, 12-year-old Roy Wright, was spared execution, but sentenced to life in prison. The boys wept. Some collapsed in shock. Outside, the crowd cheered. 9 children went looking for work. Instead, they found themselves staring at death for a crime that never even happened. News of the verdict spread like wildfire. To many in Alabama, it was justice served, but to the rest of the nation and the world, it was an outrageous scandal. Civil rights groups, labor unions, and church leaders rose up in protest. The International Labor Defense, a legal arm of the Communist Party, sent skilled lawyers. The NAACP spoke out forcefully. Newspapers from New York to London ran furious editorials. How could 9 boys be condemned to death in a trial that lasted only days, with no real defense? The Scottsboro Boys became a symbol, not just of racial injustice, but of America's broken promise of liberty and justice for all. The fight was just beginning, and it was headed all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a stunning ruling in the case of Powell versus Alabama. The court declared that the Scottsboro boys had been denied their constitutional right to effective legal counsel. Their convictions were overturned. Retrials were ordered. For a fleeting moment, hope returned. It seemed justice might finally prevail, but Alabama wasn't finished. In 1933, the boys faced new trials in Decatur, Alabama. This time, they had a powerhouse defense team led by Samuel Leibowitz, a brilliant and famous lawyer from New York. He systematically demolished the prosecution's case, exposing every lie and inconsistency. And then, something truly remarkable happened. Ruby Bates, one of the original accusers, took the stand for the defense. Through trembling lips, she told the truth. She confessed that no rape had ever occurred. Victoria Price had invented the story to avoid being charged with vagrancy and crossing state lines for immoral purposes. They were never attacked. The boys were innocent. Gasps filled the courtroom. This was the moment that should have set them free. But it didn't. Despite Ruby's sworn testimony, despite the complete lack of credible evidence, the all-white jury convicted the boys again. Sentences of death and decades in prison followed. Why? Because in the Jim Crow South of 1933, the truth was no match for racial hatred. The word of a black boy, even when supported by a white woman's confession, still meant nothing against the accusation of another white woman. Between 1933 and 1937, the boys endured a torturous cycle of trials and retrials. Each time, a new jury. Each time, a new verdict, always guilty. Some were sentenced to death, others to life behind bars. The case dragged on, an endless loop of hope and crushing despair. In prison, the boys grew from teenagers into men. Their childhoods were gone, their futures erased. One of them, Ozzie Powell, finally cracked under the immense pressure. During a prison transport, he grabbed a knife and slashed a guard's throat. He was beaten nearly to death in retaliation. He survived, but he was forever broken. Meanwhile, protests raged worldwide. Marches filled the streets of New York, London, and Paris. The Scottsboro boys had become international symbols of American hypocrisy. Under this immense global pressure, Alabama began to quietly release some of them on parole, starting in 1937. But freedom wasn't really freedom. Wherever they went, the stigma of the case followed them. They were out of prison, but they were still shackled by their past. Each boy's life became its own tragedy. Haywood Patterson managed to escape prison, fled north, and even wrote a memoir called Scottsboro Boy. But he never found peace. He lived under false names, constantly on the run, and died young in Detroit. Clarence Norris tried to rebuild his life, working odd jobs and raising a family. Finally, in 1976, he received a full and unconditional pardon from Alabama's governor, the only one of the 9 to be officially cleared in his lifetime. Roy Wright, the youngest, carried the heaviest burden. Years later, crushed by a lifetime of despair, he took his own life. The others faded into obscurity, lost to poverty, alcoholism, and early deaths. They were supposed to be men with families, careers, and futures. Instead, they became ghosts of a trial that had stolen everything from them. Even when prison doors open, injustice does not end. It follows, it lingers, it scars. Despite their immense suffering, the Scottsboro boys forever changed America. Their case led to 2 landmark Supreme Court decisions. Powell versus Alabama in 1932 guaranteed the right to competent legal counsel for all defendants in capital cases. And Norris versus Alabama in 1935 ruled that excluding black citizens from juries was unconstitutional. These decisions reshaped the American legal system and laid crucial groundwork for future civil rights victories. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, when Martin Luther King Jr. marched from Selma to Montgomery when the Civil Rights Act was finally signed into law, the echoes of the Scottsboro case were there. The boys themselves were broken, but their suffering lit a path for others to follow. It took more than 80 years. In 2013, the state of Alabama finally issued posthumous pardons for the last 3 Scottsboro boys who had never been formally cleared. 80 years too late. By then, every single one of them was dead. None of them lived to hear the two simple words they had deserved all along. Not guilty. What is justice when it comes only at the graveside? What is freedom when your life has already been taken from you? The Scottsboro boys never chose to be symbols. They were just kids on a train, chasing work, chasing a sliver of hope. But history dragged them into a battle they could never escape. Their story isn't just about the past. It's about now. It's about every system that still silences the truth, and every voice that still goes unheard. Because when the gavel falls, the echoes remain. And sometimes, the loudest truths are spoken by those who never had the chance to speak at all. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories that matter. See you next time.